All right, Chapter 6 begins on page 463, and this is titled The End of the New Deal, and it really does help us better understand that the New Deal is not what got us out of the Depression, but rather it was the war. This is a time period where Roosevelt's he's kind of pulling out all the stops, so to speak. He's trying to find ways to deal with unemployment. He's trying to deal with Americans' pocketbooks being empty. And what does that look like? Is there any way to overcome that on a federal government level? And he does run into some problems. He's accused of overreaching. He is pushed to his very limit. The best example of him overreaching is something called the court packing scheme or the court packing scandal. And this is going to really epitomize or show you what he has gone to, the lengths he's gone to hopefully get what he needs to be done. What he has concluded in the Supreme Court, the justices are too conservative. They are being a problem to him in his efforts to get the country out of the Depression, and so he wants to suggest that they up the number of justices in the Supreme Court from 9. He wants to move it up so that hopefully he can bring in the new justices that would be more moderate, that would hopefully enact some of his, or help him, support him in some of his efforts with the New Deal. He wants to pass this legislation. He wants to up it to 15, so he wants to add 6. Now, the rule is that the president is the one that can nominate these new justices. See, it's going to work perfectly. Exactly explains this court packing plan. Well, as he does this, he ends up looking pretty bad. Looks like it's a power grab. Congress did not want to cooperate with this. He ends up looking pretty rough. He ends up looking like a power-hungry, money-grubbing kind of guy that will do anything to get his way. So he kind of has to back down with that, and we see a number more of his New Deal ideas being shot down. So what we see happening, and this particular chapter goes through kind of what he ends up enduring in those last few years of the New Deal and how he's going to deal with that. So we move into Chapter 7 where it talks about the culture. Now this book, if you've not caught on to it yet, usually the end of each unit, usually around Chapter 6 or Chapter 7, it specifically addresses culture. It uses a whole chapter to deal with what's going on in the country. Now you know the politics, and now you know a little bit about what's happening in the country. How does that impact the individual, and what's it look like? And we see a good bit of that taking impact in the 30s, and we see a lot of Americans kind of changing how they find entertainment, changing how they are going to relate with the rest of the world, and a lot of that isolationism is going to come into play right here. Your book talks about the advent or the beginning of the use of movies, particularly on the big screen. You see a lot of radio for entertainment. Goes through a few of those listed on page 469. The Green Hornet, Ripley's Believe It or Not, Tarzan, Dick Tracy, Buck Rogers, as well as several other. Little Orphan Annie, you guys have probably at least heard of that. And when we talk about movies, we see a need, I guess is the best way to explain it, to somehow impact the culture of America in a positive way, because the Roman Catholic Church in the United States, they formed something called the Legion of Decency. 7 million parishioners signed pledges that they would not see indecent films. And what that means is they're going to address incest, abortion, drug abuse, profanity, homosexuality, or interracial sex. These are things that the Americans that are Catholic and identify this particular group come into play and say, we're not going to be a part of this anymore. In 1930, we see the establishment of the Hays Code, and it kind of, your book uses the word, it nannies the film industry, and it's going to be the precursor to the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors Association, really kind of pushing them into this necessity of we want to see proper films being made. It goes into a little bit about some of these movies, particularly Grapes of Wrath is an adaptation of John Steinbeck's popular novel about the Depression era. That'll be on your test. You see Henry Ford playing the leading role, which that's becoming less and less relevant as you guys get younger and younger. by my estimate, of course. But you also see some historical movies, Mutiny on the Bounty. You also see Gone with the Wind. You see comedies. It goes through that list as well. Animal Crackers, Horse Feathers, and Night at the Opera. The Our Gang series, which you guys are a little bit more familiar with who's in that rather than that name. Our Gang is on your test. Some of those very familiar and likable characters, Spanky, Alfalfa, Buckwheat, some of these are familiar to you as well. You also see horror films like Dracula, King Kong, Frankenstein, as well as Walt Disney. His animation skills come to the screen during this time, and the first full-length feature film through that is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which if you've watched it recently, you can certainly tell it's older, but it's just so remarkable to me that they did something like that, and that would have been done by hand. That's not computer animation. That is truly the work of somebody's hand. You also see the launching of a photographic journal magazine called Life. You also see newspapers and magazines such as The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Red Book, Reader's Digest, Times, etc. You see all these coming to play where Americans are interested in their ingesting and they're just taking it all in. You also see social justice writers such as John Steinbeck, known for a number of different books, as I already mentioned, The Grapes of Wrath, which was turned into a movie later on. But Of Mice and Men, maybe you read that in high school. You also see Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son. I read in high school Black Boy. And so there's probably a few that maybe you know of that aren't mentioned in the book. You also have William Faulkner, who's known for his kind of stream of consciousness writing, which for me, this is my personal opinion, it's really hard for me to follow, but a lot of people love him and really do appreciate his work. Known for As I Lay Dying, Absalom, Absalom, as well as a number of others. You also see this is a time period where Americans become really anxious, and there's a large reason for that, not the least of which is because there's something brewing in Europe. And that's what will take us into the introduction on page 473. The introduction, remember, it jumps ahead in the action, and then we kind of slow back down and jump back into chapter 1. The first thing you need to know from the intro is December 7th, 1941. This is the date that will live in infamy. There's a number of really cool stories to tell about the attack on Pearl Harbor, as far as the amazing men who fought almost just in their t-shirt and pants, just being awoken by this terrible incident. What this particular introduction does is it goes through Pearl Harbor and it gives you kind of a timeline of how this happens. And if you've not seen some movies about this, I encourage you maybe to consider Tora, Tora, Tora. It's an older movie, but it's kind of shot mainly, I don't know if it's quite mainly, but probably 50-50, if not more so, shot from a Japanese perspective. And it's got a few subtitles, but it's just a very good movie as far as giving you an idea of what happened. It's really well made. It was done in 1970, so it's not quite modern picture making like you and I are familiar with, but it's very, very well made. It's very interesting. Hopefully, if you've got the time, check it out. It's not going to be on Netflix, though, I will tell you that. So do make sure to read through the introduction, get kind of familiar with what Pearl Harbor is all about. On chapter 1 on page 477, this is kind of the closing out of the New Deal era and moving us into World War II. Roosevelt paid very close attention to what was going on in Europe. There were a number of issues. If we talk about the timeline, I always go back to the analogy of my kids like to play with dominoes and setting them up, and you knock one down, and how it just basically flattens the table of dominoes, and how it just happens, boom, boom, boom. That's so much of what happens with World War II, much like the First World War. There's several things I want to point out to you in case you've missed them here. You definitely need to know some of these characters. Do keep in mind, while he's not on your test, you'd want to make sure, kind of keep in mind who Nicholas Romanoff is. He's important in that he is going to be the guy that sees the end of the Russian state as it had been known for so very long. He was ineffective. He was in many ways, he's useless as a military leader. He tried to go out and prove himself, and instead he ends up proving what a terrible leader he was. With that, it sets him up to be a communist threat later on. They do go through a provisional government before that, but we'll get back to them later on. Mussolini is the name you do want to know for your test. Rose to power in 1922. I always liken him in my classes. I talk about Mussolini, and particularly with his relationship with Hitler. Mussolini is probably a decent leader. I'm not talking about him morally. I'm just talking about his ability as a leader. But he's not really one of these guys you would expect to rise to greatness. It's when he gets into bed with Hitler that things begin to change for him. And I always remember this commercial that I saw as a little girl where you've got these two dogs walking down the street. It's a little bitty dog that's kind of yip, 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 and it's carrying on with the bigger dog, and it's jumping over the big bulldog's head, and, what do you want to do today, Spike? And it kind of goes back and forth. Well, this is kind of what I think about with Mussolini, because he's not really this standout guy, but there's something that happens when he's around Hitler that he does stuff that I don't know that Mussolini would have ever had the power to do beforehand, or would have had the guts to do beforehand. That's not adoration coming from my voice. It's just sheer shock in so many ways. But Mussolini rises to power with the effort of the black shirt fascist. He ends up seizing control of the government, where he basically dreams of a Roman Empire without really the means to make that happen. Initially, he's very popular, very well liked. In the meantime, you have the rise to power of Adolf Hitler, who you need to know as well. Hitler comes to power in quite the flourish, in that he's never really elected to this high office. He basically works his way, or worms his way, into this position. What's important to know about Hitler, among many things, please don't hear me underestimating Hitler as far as what you could know about him, but Hitler is this guy that comes in with such hatred. He'd participated in the First World War. He certainly does not get the opportunity to participate as much as he wants to, as he's wounded early on. He kind of devises this idea in between the two wars that it's the Jews that caused the fight to end, and that they really could have won, that the Germans could have risen to true power had the Jews not been an obstacle. Now, he does add to his list of, I hate these people, but he is one of these guys that comes to power riding on the back of people that are humiliated by the Versailles Treaty, and he has the answer. And I don't know how you guys are, and this is kind of confession time, I guess, for me. Sometimes I need to have something to blame something on. It's terrible, certainly not very Christian of me, but that you certainly see Hitler with that idea. He capitalizes on that need to blame somebody for the loss of the First World War for the German people. Between that, the humiliating loss, the Versailles Treaty basically causing them to have to take the blame for every bit of the war, and then the Depression that drives them to the brink of complete destruction as a country. He comes in with the right answers, and the Germans listen to him. With that economic crisis, that chaos going on, Hitler just sort of is able to work his way up into power quite easily. The president is Paul von Hindenburg, and he is going to allow Hitler to come alongside of him and be his number two man. Eventually, Hindenburg is kind of just ceding his power straight to Hitler before he finally just takes over. He secretly ordered the Reichstag burned by his Nazi police, and he ends up blaming radicals as well as Jews. He decides to use that opportunity to suppress the freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. When Hindenburg dies, Hitler just basically is the undisputed leader. No one's fighting about it. This is just the way it is. And he is going to come in with a flourish. I've read biographies on him. I've read Mein Kampf. I've read several things about Hitler. I have in my head that Hitler came to power with a very clear plan of action. Certainly some of that would have had to change. He didn't have an all-seeing eye that knew exactly how things were going to happen, or else we certainly know things would have been different with the war. But Hitler comes in, and he's already been working on efforts to push them into the Second World War before he even takes full power. And so what we see here is he withdraws from the League of Nations. He begins an arms race where he's restocking the people. He is growing the army. He is preaching a hate of Jewish people as well as others that were kind of seen as dissidents by Hitler. He considers the Jewish people to be inferior, non-human, and he is going to do everything he can to destroy them. In 1936, he sets his eyes on the Rhineland. Now, this was something that he felt like he could very easily take, and Britain and France all but stepped aside and let him walk right in. It's a very easy success for him, and he does several times in Hitler's progress towards the Second World War. He keeps saying, this is all I wanted. I just want our German people together. German-speaking people should be with German-speaking people. And so these world leaders, instead of saying, no, that's not okay, they let him do this time and time again. In the meantime, Germany is also building up industry. They'd kind of been stripped of all of that at the end of the First World War, and so they struggled for some time. We also see Italy trying to catch up. They were far behind as far as industrialization. You also see Japan. They had struggled post-World War I as far as trying to catch up with the rest of the world, their industrialization as well as their agricultural advancements. We see these three countries kind of identifying with each other because of their struggles and their frustration with the United States. Certainly Japan is struggling with the United States as far as tariffs as well as negotiating with countries that Japan hates. Japan begins to take this idea of we realize we're a small little country on an island. We need to grow, and so where do we look? Now picture a world map in your head. Where's the closest thing? Oh, well, Asia. And so they begin developing ideas for conquest. If we can take over China, then we can have all that land, all those natural resources, and raw materials. There's also this idea of, really in many regards, everything I've read about Japan during this time period is they have this greater ambition than they possibly could ever do. How in the world could this little bitty island nation invade such a large Chinese nation? Well, there's a number of ways that they really could have. China in many ways was backwards as well. And so they begin pushing. They use terminology. It's really ingenious. Their idea is we're not invading China. We're not trying to take them over in a hostile manner. We want Asia for Asians, which essentially, if you boil it down, it really meant Japan, or Asia for Japan. So we see this really does affect the future of the world at large. Make sure and read that particular material. As we've already talked about from previous material, America is still in this good neighbor policy plan of action. We are trying to deal with our own problems in our own hemisphere. That's your war. We're going to stay over here and deal with our people. And so we see a fair amount of this happening with Roosevelt and those around him, just trying to kind of keep our focus right here. All the while, I think from everything I've read, Roosevelt knew it was coming. In Chapter 2 on page 483, it talks about how this isolationism, this idea that we're just going to stay over here, y'all can do your own thing over there, it begins to impact the world at large. Really what we see is there's no country that can stand up to Hitler and Germany. In that, he begins to align himself. This is where we see him align himself with Mussolini, as well as a fascist in Spain who is by the name of Franco. Now, Franco is not necessarily interested in joining this great big alliance as Spain is going through a civil war right now. But Hitler uses the civil war. He says, hey, well, let's be friends, Franco. Let me help you with your war. He wants to overthrow the previous government, help Franco do that. So what he does is he sends all these new Nazi weapons, and he sends in his highest commanders to kind of coach the Franco military experts to help them kind of know how to run this war. This is Hitler's training ground. This is where he can see if his tanks are going to work better, if his machine guns are going to work better, if his battle tactics are going to work better. He uses this as an effort to see how things are going to go. Now, how does this impact American history? Because this is an American history course. Well, in a very unique way. Americans, for some reason, are always about the underdog. And so there's a lot of Americans that want to go fight. They want to go participate in this war. Roosevelt comes out very clearly, absolutely under no circumstances will we go be a part of this Spanish War. But there are a few Americans that join the Lincoln Brigade and go over to Spain and fight with the Loyalists, or fight for the Loyalists. It's kind of a unique and interesting situation for sure. In the meantime, you see Hitler and Mussolini growing closer, and they form something called the Axis powers. In 1937, Japan attacks Manchuria in this effort for Asia for Asians. In July of that year, Japan and Chinese War broke out as well. Now, your book tells you that there are some historians that say this is the opening act of World War II. There are several events or several aspects of the timeline here that historians do argue about what's the beginning of the Second World War. I don't fall in line with this, although it's a pretty good point. I have no problem as far as I could see where you're coming from. This just isn't really what I think of as far as the starting point. In the meantime, you see a number of neutrality acts passed by the United States and Roosevelt in an effort to keep the Americans from hopefully getting involved in the war before they need to. Freedom of the seas is a problem, of course. We also see a number of issues fighting with Japan as far as we are supporters of China. So if we get involved in this, it just was this big old mess. So make sure and read page 484, 485 to learn a little bit more about this. In the meantime, Roosevelt kind of sends out a strange little test balloon, so to speak, called the quarantine speech. And you need to know that for your test. This is where he is speaking to the American people to kind of see if they're ready for a greater action. And you can read a little bit about this on page 485, 486. There's just an excerpt from his speech here. What he finds almost immediately is that most Americans are still not quite ready to go into war, but this will change very quickly. On page 486, it talks about Blitzkrieg, which is lightning war. Anschluss, which is the effort by the Germans to annex Austria. It's completely peaceful. Nobody fights him on it, which is what kind of allows him to keep moving forward in his timeline. And then the next in this is the Sudetenland, and this is a portion of Czechoslovakian soil. Remember, Czechoslovakia was created at the end of the First World War, and so Hitler says there's a lot of people here that are German-speaking that really do belong in the German country, so we just want this little section of the Sudetenland. Unfortunately, what that means is once the British and the French agree to let him take it. By the way, the Czechs weren't invited to that meeting. Hitler ends up taking all of it. Surprise, surprise. As they do this, Chamberlain has famously already said before the invasion, I believe we have come to peace in our time. Churchill disagreed. At this point, he's not the top guy. He does rise to that role pretty soon. Churchill sees this as the coward's way out. Now, if you move on into page 487, 488, you've got the gray box where it talks about the World's Fair. Do make sure to read about that. It's kind of almost comical to me that while this massive bloodshed, this craziness going on in Europe, and we're having this really cool event over in New York City. So make sure and read about that because you'll want to know about it for your test. I'll be back in just a moment with Chapter 3.